So, what we've done is we've discussed the war in Europe as it relates to the up to the German failure to capture Moscow in the autumn of 1941. Now we're going to go back and look eastward. When France falls and Germany, Italy, and Japan sign the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo Axis Agreement, what happens is the Japanese see an opportunity. One of the things that all three of these fascist powers are trying to do is to achieve autarky, which is an economical self-sufficiency. You'll note, by the way, that I altered the projection on this map and expanded it to include the entire, well, most of the Pacific. France controls French Indochina, which are the modern countries of Laos, Cambodia, and North and South Vietnam, what's now Vietnam. And this is the rice bowl of Asia. This is where much of Asia's rice is grown. And Japanese use rice as a staple. So the Japanese basically do a deal with the Germans, whereby the Germans convince the French to allow the Japanese to occupy French Indochina. This is basically an extortion deal, and the Japanese march in and take over French Indochina. Now, at this point, the Japanese are deep inside of China. They control about a third of nationalist China, but that third includes most of the major cities, and they also control Manchuria and Korea, and they're basically on the march. So President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States decides that we are going to do something about this. And what we're going to do is we are going to embargo oil that is bound for Japan. At that time, the United States was the major source of Japan's oil supplies. Yes, we were then, as we have since recently become thanks to fracking, an exporter of oil around the world. And the Japanese depended upon our oil. This goes to show you how powerful you can be if you control the vital industries of another nation. Not that that would ever happen again. No, you can figure that one out on your own. So the United States embargoes Japanese oil until such a time as the Japanese withdraws its troops from what the United States still calls French Indochina. The Japanese, this happens in spring to summer 1941, so the Japanese are faced with a conundrum. They cannot do without American oil under the current circumstances. So what they could do is they could agree and knuckle under to the Americans and march out of Indochina, which would involve a massive loss of face, a loss of public respect, certainly in their own mind. Or they could find another source for oil and seize it. And it just so happens that the island of Borneo, which is a part of British Malaysia and the Dutch East Indies, is a source of oil. So the Japanese, instead of bowing and scraping before the Americans, could take the oil. And if you know anything about what I've said about the imperial government of Japan, you should have no difficulty figuring out what the Japanese are going to choose. So they have got to seize the oil. But if they seize the oil, that oil is going to pass perilously close to the American Philippines. So they better take the American Philippines. Now, everyone and his brother knows what will happen if the Japanese attack the American Philippines. It's called Naval Plan Orange, and it's been around since as long as we've owned the Philippines. Basically, on the Philippine island of Manila, to the south and west of the city, on the Philippine island of Luzon, where the capital city of Manila rests, south and east of Manila are the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. What American forces are supposed to do is withdraw into those redoubts, those fortresses. Corregidor is a little island that controls Manila Bay, and Bataan also controls the entrances, on one side anyway, to Manila Bay. And we hold out. And War Plan Orange has the American battle fleet, which at that time was based in San Diego, move to Hawaii, resupply, and fight its way across the Pacific until it eventually arrives at Luzon to relieve the American position. And since this battle plan is so known and so predictable, the Japanese naval commander, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, decides, why play the Americans' game? Now, Yamamoto had spent time in the United States as a naval attaché. He enjoyed playing poker. And his job as naval attaché was to learn about the United States and about the American Navy in case Japan one day would have to fight them. And so Yamamoto, who spent time as a young man in the United States, is now commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he has advised consistently that the United States is a sleeping giant. It may seem soft and weak and decadent and filled with a bunch of nonsense Western values, but if you wake it up, if you push it, it will arise with a terrible fury. But the order comes down that the Imperial Council has approved a war plan. And so if it's to be war, Yamamoto says the only way that Japan can defeat the United States in open battle is to do such crushing victories in the opening 6 months of the war that the United States will sue for peace. Because if the war goes on much beyond 6 months, the Japanese advantage in existent forces at the beginning of the war will be overtaken by the vast American capacity at that point for industrial production, and they'll overwhelm the Japanese. So Yamamoto's plan is to shock the Americans and defeat them psychologically as well as physically. So he authorizes a plan that has the Kitubutai, the Japanese carrier striking force, cross the Pacific and approach by stealth to the north of the island of Oahu, where Honolulu is and where Pearl Harbor is, and where the American fleet has been based since the beginning of 1941. We decided to show Japan that we were ready for them by moving our fleet thousands of miles closer to them, but also to the Hawaiian Islands, to a position to dominate the Central Pacific. So Yamamoto's plan is to use the Japanese aircraft carriers to approach Hawaii from the north and sink the American battle fleet in port. How does he know this can work? Because at Taranto, the Italian Navy base, Taranto, Taranto, which is near the heel of Italy, the British caught the Italian battle fleet in port. And with swordfish torpedo bombers, they sank most of the Italian fleet in a shallow harbor. If the British can do it, the Japanese reason, we can do it. So they alter their torpedoes to operate in a fairly shallow harbor, and this is the plan. Now let me tell you about the Kitubutai. The Japanese carrier striking force is probably, with the exception of certain British and German and SS units or British elite units, probably the best war force on the planet. It is certainly the best of its type. Japanese aircraft carrier pilots are treated like samurai. Whether or not they're born samurai, they are treated like knights of old. They are given great deference and great respect, and it's considered a vocation, a life's calling. So Japanese carrier pilots are trained from late childhood and early adolescence in a special education system that produces what is at that time by far the best carrier pilots in the world. And the Japanese have 6 fleet carriers, plus a few minor ones. So when this force is going to be used, Japan is going to use a peerless piece of military asset. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. These 6 aircraft carriers have the best naval aviators on the planet, much better than ours at that stage. And at this point in time, the American admirals are still wedded to the idea of battleships being the most important vessel in the fleet. Battleships dominate the battlefield with turreted artillery of from 12 to 18 inches in diameter. That's what it fires, a bullet of 12 to 18 inches in diameter. But aircraft carrier don't have a range just over the horizon, 25, 26 miles. Aircraft carriers can reach out and touch somebody 2, 3, 4, 500 miles away. Longer if you have a different place to refuel. So the Americans are dreaming the dreams of peace. Now, a week before December 7th, the weekend of December 1st, 1941, our code breakers at Pearl Harbor warned the Department of the Navy and Washington in general that the Japanese fleet had mobilized, they were at sea, and they were getting ready to strike Pearl Harbor in a sneak attack, probably inspired by Britain's attack on the Italian base at Taranto. The fleet mobilized, it went out to sea, it engaged in maneuvers, it's wasted a lot of fuel, it spent a lot of time, no Japanese showed up. Our code breakers had gotten it right, but they'd gotten the date wrong. It was going to be a week later. Well, as that week was working itself to its end, the same messages provoked the same warnings. But by this point, these code breakers were considered to be the boy who cried wolf, and they weren't listened to. We'll see what happens next.